Good morning, everyone. The World Food Day was founded by the United Nations, the FAO, back in 1945. And actually, that was also the FAO was founded back in 1945 in Quebec City. Yes, it's Canadian, right? And has been observed annually every October 16th of every year since 1981. The event was established to increase awareness of world hunger and poverty and to inspire solutions toward change. With the theme, Leave No One Behind, better production, better nutrition, and better environment, and a better life, the World Food Day 2022 campaign calls for global solidarity and action to transform agri-food systems in a bid to foster inclusive economic growth, address inequalities, increase resilience, and achieve sustainable development. More should be done to assist small-scale farmers, which produce more than a third of the world's food, but represent 80% of the world's producers. They are one of the foundations of the world's agri-food systems, yet they are too often trapped in cycles of poverty and food insecurity, and excluded, unfortunately, from opportunities in systems dominated by large producers and retailers. This requires transforming current agri-food system to provide equal opportunities for all producers and helping smallholders gain access to new markets. Investments in training, incentives, science, data, and innovation can go a long way in placing smallholders at the center of this transformation and become active and equal agents of sustainable development. Now I have the pleasure to introduce our speaker of today, Mrs. Denise Mariella Johnston. Denise, a national of Trinidad and Tobago, has been involved in development communication throughout the English-speaking Caribbean for over 30 years. She trained in general agriculture and agriculture extension at the University of West Indies before going on to develop communication skills in England at Ian MacDonald and Associates, rural development at the University of Reading in England, and strategic communication planning at Malmö University in Sweden. Her interest in development has led her to expand beyond agriculture into the education, health and nutrition sectors. Denise has worked with the national, regional, and international organizations, helping to facilitate communication among scientists and with various stakeholders, including food producers and processors, donors, and government officials responsible for policy development. She believes that well-planned strategic communication is a key ingredient in the success of any development initiative. Mrs. Johnston, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Godbawi. I'm very pleased to be here in person from Trinidad. World Food Day 2022 is very dear to my heart, the theme being Leave No One Behind. And as someone, a female, from a small island in the global south, I feel I'm here to speak on behalf of those who are being left behind. World Food Day is an initiative of the Food and Agriculture Organization, and their mandate is to improve nutrition, increase agricultural productivity, raise the standard of living in rural populations, and contribute to global economic growth. So they have that umbrella function for agriculture internationally. I am going to talk about repositioning communication in food and nutrition initiatives, and I'm going to probably leave out the nutrition part because it's so integral to the whole food thrust that if I leave it out, don't think I'm ignoring nutrition. We have a nutritionist here in the audience. So I'm going to start with the current state of food security globally and in Latin America and the Caribbean, hopefully spending brief time on that so that we can then move into what I'm really here to talk about, what I'm really passionate about, the communication aspect and communication in development projects, particularly with respect to food and nutrition. The World Food Summit in 1996 says that food security, which is what we're talking about here, exists when all people, at all times, in 1996, all people at all times, have physical and economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food to meet their dietary needs and food preferences for an active and healthy life. What that looks like is food security, that umbrella, deals with the availability of food. There's sufficient quantity. There's enough stock. There's enough, whether it's produced in the country or traded, there's enough. That people have access to this food, economic access, physical access to this food. That here's the nutrition part, and that's why it's so integral to the whole food security thing, that it's utilized well in bodies, that the food choices and everything is food prep, how food is prepared, whether it's safe, has implications for water and sanitation as well. And then the sustainability of all of these things, because you can have availability, access, utilization at one point in time and not at another, in which case you're not food secure. The United Nations came up with 17 global goals that they would like to see come to fruition in 2030. The first two, I think, are important to us. No poverty, but more importantly, zero hunger. Zero hunger in 2030. Unfortunately, we're a little bit off from the goal. I'm saying a little bit. It's quite a lot off from that goal. There have been severe challenges over the past 3 years, particularly. There are always challenges, but over the past 3 years, we've had COVID-19 pandemic. We've had the actual illness. We've had the lockdowns as a consequence of the illness, and those lockdowns caused severe economic hardships. I think we would all have seen in the news migrant workers in India who had gone to look for work in towns and cities, having to go back to their rural areas where they came from, originated from, because there was no work. There was no work, there was no food, there was no access to food, there was no family support. We had climate variability and extremes all over the world. Higher temperatures, reduced yield, reduced quality of food, conflict and civil instability, and of course, that's a lot of times local, but international. The war in Ukraine is foremost in everybody's minds when you think about conflict and instability. And that is significant because Russia and Ukraine, before the war, produced 30% of wheat, 20% of maize, and 80% of sunflower seed. This is global supply. A lot of countries, their basic food is wheat-based, corn-based. Animal foods, sunflower seeds, goes into a whole lot of other things as well. So even before the war, we had that supply, and now that is being threatened. Is an issue. Income loss and rising prices as a result of the previous three issues. People who never expected to be out of a job are now finding themselves food insecure. People with good paying jobs, with prospects for long-term employment. Prices rising because of energy costs, because of limited availability, that whole supply and demand thing. In terms of economic slowdown, that was happening even before the pandemic. Some countries were already going into recession. So you can imagine now how these issues are affecting those countries. And of course, there are some socioeconomic issues as well. There's unequal access to food resources by vulnerable groups like low-skilled workers who no longer have a job, like women. And it varies from country to country. Just to have a visual, the projection for 2030 below, the dotted line, the top black shows you the global projection. And the top, what actually happened, where we're at that pinnacle, and then what's projected to 2030. The turquoise is Asia, the orange Africa and Latin America, and the Caribbean is in the green below. The global differentiation is, I think it's 78 million. That is a lot more people than we expected to be food insecure, is it, by that time, at that time. Extreme climate conditions. The bar charts show percentages of countries exposed to 3 or 4 different types of climate extremes. The first bar shows you 20,000 to 2004, and you see it rising. 3 or 4, that's, you're being pummeled from many avenues. And the top is just the percentage of countries exposed to climate extremes. It's rising anyhow you take it. So in numbers, what does that look like? No access to adequate food, 1 in 3 people. That's an increase in just 1 year, an increase in 320 million people in just 1 year. Moderate to severe food insecurity, right now in 2020, equal to the previous 5 years combined. Severe food insecurity, 148 million more than in 2019. Remember, this is 2020 we're talking about. 148 million in 1 year. And undernourishment, after remaining virtually unchanged in the 5 years prior to 2020, went up 1.5 percentage points. And then it's not equal across the board. Undernourishment increased 1.5%. Well, yes, after remaining, it's 10% higher among women than men, because we spoke about the vulnerable groups. That's not to be scoffed at all. And then another vulnerable group, children, 5 years of age and under. Stunting, affecting 22% of the global population. 6.7% were suffering from wasting, and 5.7% were overweight. If you come from the Caribbean like I do, you'd wonder, well, is overweight an issue? We like chubby children. But overweight implies high fat, high carb, not enough fruit, not enough vegetables, so poor nutrition. And we spoke about challenges, and I want to now zero in on what I really know about, which is Latin America and the Caribbean. we do have more extreme events. Quite apart from annual hurricanes, we've had a volcano erupting in St. Vincent towards the end of 2020 and into the first quarter of 2021. And you would think, well, okay, that's one island. The ash from that island affected neighboring countries. And in Barbados, which is flat, tourist dependent, it caused $87 million worth of damage to water. In a small, flat coral island, your water is your most precious resource. Depending on tourism, you need water. You need water for your agricultural production as well. Covered crops, covered buildings, collapsed roofs, contaminated water. So we've had quite a lot of extreme events. We do have higher temperatures that we had not felt before in my lifetime. And it means then that if you're doing food production in open fields, then the time for working is now has to be adjusted. We've had declining rainfall, and when we do have rainfall, it's a lot in a small area, so that you now have flooding. We have saltwater intrusion, where an area of a lot of islands, some of us quite flat. So as sea level rises, we have intrusion of saltwater affecting our water sources, affecting our agriculture. And if you're into soils, you will know that land contaminated by saltwater is very difficult, if not impossible, to rehabilitate. Transport and trade, we were separated by water. High fuel prices has wreaked havoc on our communities. And we have labor, young people, not wanting to carry on the family business, wanting to move into an office job. And even people, even farmers with their farms and so, parents want their children to have a better life than they had and move out of agriculture into an office. I don't know what COVID has done to that, because COVID to me has been a great equalizer. What has happened, it sort of shifted things so that office jobs were far more risky. If you had an agricultural plot, small, large, however, you could at least feed yourself. So it would be interesting to find out how, from the sociological point of view, socioeconomic studies, what has that shifted things? Let's see. If we move hemispheric, because I tend to focus on the Caribbean, the English-speaking Caribbean, but hemispherically, including Latin America and the Caribbean, we are food importers. We import $6 billion worth of food, imports. We are net food importers, except for Belize and Guyana. Those are mainland countries in the Caribbean. And at least 7 countries import more than 80% of the food consumed. That's not, difficult to imagine. If you're a tourist-oriented economy, you don't have a lot of investments in agriculture, you don't have the land to produce, to feed all these tourists coming in. You're going to have to get food that your tourists are going to enjoy. So a lot of food is imported. I already talked about the difficulty with inter-island trade and intra-regional trade, getting food from other countries into our countries. With respect to food insecurity, there's been a 30% rise in people living with hunger. 7 million people were undernourished. And people who experience moderate to severe food insecurity, remember we're expanding it now to Latin America as well, was 60 million more than in 2019. That's 41% of the population, if you can imagine. 41% of a population experiencing moderate to severe food insecurity. And affected by severe now, we're just focusing on that severe group, 27.5 million more than 2019, and our children, we spoke about overweight children, almost 2% percentage points above the world average. I'm just thinking of well, you know that there's unrest in Venezuela, and we were looking at a documentary, and mothers were feeding their babies sugar water. So when you're looking at, you know, increased weights and thinking that it might be healthy, that is the reality. And you might ask, well, what about breastfeeding? But the mother's nutritional levels not very high either. So they're not able to produce the kinds of milk for their infants. I know I'm pounding this, but this study, there was a survey conducted by the Caribbean Community, which is a group I'll talk about, and the World Food Programme. And I thought that the numbers during the 6 months from March to August this year were so phenomenal that I had to share. In the English-speaking Caribbean, 57% of the population experienced moderate to severe food insecurity, because we were talking previously about 2020. So now we're just this year in 6 months. The number of food insecure people increased by 1.3 million. And almost 6% of people reported going an entire day without eating. That's a 1% increase since February of this year. And in the Dutch Caribbean, including the Dutch Caribbean countries, food inflation rose by 10.2%. So we expect those numbers at the top to go even higher. The country director for the World Food Programme said that for the first time ever, he has seen people in the Caribbean selling off their assets to purchase food. You know, we in the Caribbean, we're different, but we have a similarity in that we think that we're never going to starve because there's always some family member, some friend who could give us a little green banana, some breadfruit or something. That's changing. And to show you a little bit about where I come from, Florida, you can see that little jutting out green bit below. The Bahamas all the way down to Guyana and Suriname, and we go all the way to Belize, and then, well, the islands go to the east as well. We tiny, so we realized that we needed to come together to form groups so that we can discuss things, economic groups. So we have the OECS, which is the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States. That is in the orange box. They come together to lobby for all those islands. They make decisions also within the group of OECS. And CARICOM, we say it in the Caribbean without remembering that other people don't know that there is a CARICOM. This is the Caribbean Community. And this is how we make decisions for ourselves. We have comparative advantages each island. So how do we decide who does what? How do we decide on a global stage? How do we discuss things on a global stage? Through CARICOM. We're islands, but we're different. This is not a homogeneous space. We're coral islands, we're volcanic islands, we're Trinidad and Tobago, just off of South America. Our fauna and flora are very similar to South America, which is different all the way up the islands. We're mountainous, we're flat, We're very different. We all have our own governments. We all have our own sense of self. So it's not the Caribbean. Oh, I meet people all the time. Oh, I know a Jamaican, so I know who you are. So it's not the case. And as you can see, the mainland countries, of course, are very different, would be very different. The first time I went to Guyana, we drove and drove and drove, and I thought, oh my goodness, I had never thought of a Caribbean country as having that expanse of land. So what the implications for us in food is that they have the land resources, Guyana does, to do the crops on a large scale that other countries would be doing on a much smaller scale, which is the kind of discussion that takes place in CARICOM. CARICOM has had policy for food and agriculture over the last 45 years. And most recently, there was a CARICOM COVID-19 Agri-Food Action Plan for 2020. And then I spoke of us being net food importers. So there is a thrust to replace 25% of the food imported by 2025. There's 7 commodity groups that are being focused on, and this is the new thrust, very new, that we're looking towards for 2025. Interestingly, the Caribbean Private Sector Organization has been very key to spearheading this. So we're moving beyond, governments, agriculture, ministries, into working in a more integrated way, because they import the food, right? So they now are partnering to reduce our food import bills. So the FAO, it's not me. If I didn't convince you before, the FAO is saying that the world is at a critical juncture. The challenging global conditions have given us the clearest indication that in order to survive, we must all be on board and working together. And now I want to say we must all work together more efficiently and more effectively. And as I go on, I hope to convince you that the way to do that is by repositioning communication in our projects as we move along. We need a paradigm shift. We need to discard the old stereotypes. We need to discard the idea that the global north has solutions that we then share with the countries in the global south. We need to discard stereotypes like countries, areas, regions like the Caribbean. The farmers are all the same, the food producers are all the same, the nutrition issues are all the same. Africa is going to be very different. Asia, very different. The Pacific, even in terms of island states, small island developing states, Pacific's very different from the Caribbean. Within the Caribbean is very different. So we have to shed these stereotypes. We need to stop this kind of top-down planning and embrace a more inclusive participatory system. 20 by 25 that we spoke about, the private sector is now partnering with agriculture. That's not common. That has not been our experience. But we're moving, we're growing, we're maturing, and we need to now embrace systems that, especially if we're looking at food systems, as we will see, are very complex. So it can't be one group of people having all the answers to share. We need to move from silos. I'm at a university. and you have different departments here, and they're nice, neat little packages. But when we start working on food security issues, we have to learn how to work together. We have to learn how to understand each other. We have to learn how to share information to address an issue that is not in nice little neat packages. We need to broaden the delineation of what counts as evidence. We have the hard scientists who are going to say we need numbers. We need the social scientists who are saying, well, qualitative. We need to look at gender, and we need to talk to people, and we need to gather that kind of oral stories, and then refine that into evidence. Well, we need to do everything. We need to work together. We need to understand that there is a wealth of knowledge that exists, that has been passed on and shared and acted upon, not to be dismissed. We need to understand that when we rely on published journal articles, we're talking about a long period of time to get to there. We need to appreciate that there is a lot of research that's unpublished that exists in research institutions, in ministries of agriculture, throughout the world, in the global south. And it's valuable information. So that needs to count as well. The Global Alliance for the Future of Food says that if we don't include these diverse sources of information, then we're really not going to be as relevant as we expect ourselves to be. And then we need to consider environmental, all the other factors, political, economic, social factors, when funding initiatives. Because one size certainly doesn't fit all. And when we keep looking at increased yields, if we're talking food production, increased yields, and that is our thrust. You know, the particular commodity that you're trying to share, that information that you're trying to share, may not be suitable for the production of processing into whatever is the food that is consumed in the country. So, for instance, let me bring it to my experience. I have a breadfruit tree that produces beautiful, I don't know if you know breadfruit. It's a carbohydrate source, very delicious, growing on a tree. I have a traditional breadfruit tree, and I also have a new variety that produces over a longer period, smaller breadfruit, but over a longer period. It's also a very beautiful tree. The issue is that the texture is kind of not what I would like for the kind of dishes that I would like to produce. And you would find, as simple and as it sounds, that is the kind of obstacle you're going to meet if you don't include that cultural aspect as well. Food systems. It was produced, this definition was defined by IFPRI, the International Food Research Institute, and I'm going to read it. And I have a reason for reading this long thing. Food systems are the sum of actors and interactions along the value food chain, from input, supply, and production of crops, livestock, fish, and other agricultural commodities, to transportation, processing, retailing, wholesaling, and preparation of food, to consumption and disposal. Food systems also include the enabling policy environments and cultural norms around food. Ideal food systems would be nutrition, health, and safety driven, productive and efficient, and thus able to deliver affordable food, environmentally sustainable, and climate smart and inclusive. To realize this vision, continued investments must be made in agricultural research and development and technological innovations, paving the way for programs and policies that are based on sound evidence. I read that so that you could understand that in blue, all of those players are involved when you're looking at food systems. So coming at any issue from a soils perspective, from a livestock production, from a horticultural, whatever you're coming at in isolation is not going to take all of this into consideration. All of these players. GAIN, the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition, you're not expected to read it, don't worry. But you see that complex web? You focus on one little area and you're missing out on a whole lot of other areas that impact on what you're doing. And as I said, you could do your research and have the best thing, the best solution in terms of improving your yields. But if the product is not suitable to produce whatever the local, the food produced from that is, the processing aspect of it, if it's not the right texture, gives the right product, you're going to lose out. So you're producing food, you're talking to the producers, but you forgot to talk to the woman who's producing, who's going to be processing that. So this is just to show you how complex it is and how interactive it all is. So we need to ask some fundamental questions. Where are the food insecure populations? And if I ask you, you will tell me in the global south, right? So I think so. This is Canada in 2021. 1/6 of the population was food insecure. This is 10 provinces. This is just to illustrate what is happening across the globe. We're in Canada, so I chose Canada. 1/6. That's not insignificant. Who are they? Again, Canada. Half of the population has wages, salaries, or are self-employed. So we're not talking about unemployed people and all of that kind of thing. It's mind-boggling to me. Who produces and processes the food? We're thinking, because the aspect of food security that I'm focusing now on is where we're getting our food from. Thinking farmers in the field. But then we have some young agripreneurs who, I learned that term recently, I'm very proud to share it, who are producing in vertical indoor structures, which means that they don't have to worry about the rising climates. They don't have to worry about too much rainfall or too little rainfall or saltwater intrusion or all the rest of it. These are young people who are looking at agriculture differently. They're not wanting to work out in the fields, but they're approaching it as a business. So I'm just suggesting, again, dismantling the stereotypes that we must include greenhouse production, we must include these young people. What are the resource constraints? What are the constraints for these young people who don't have the resources to set up this kind of thing? We need to then perhaps provide the kinds of credit that they need. Where is the expertise? In my region, We have the University of the West Indies, which has a long, long legacy of work in agriculture, having started from the Imperial College of Tropical Agriculture. That is where it started, at the University of the West Indies, and then it moved from there into other subject areas. So we have that. We have the Caribbean Agricultural Research and Development Institute, CARDI, which works in the Caribbean, and then we have ICA. These are not at all exhaustive, but I'm suggesting these three as examples. The Inter-American Institute for Cooperation in Agriculture, they're hemispheric, so they are Latin America and the Caribbean. So when we speak about research, these organizations also have research that is unpublished, valuable research done by students, done by other researchers, valuable research. And I know, I worked at CARDI before, that we had what we call gray literature, unpublished but valuable. And I'm talking about the expertise because it means that donors, other organizations can partner with institutions on the ground, which means you have, you're partnering with people who understand the communities that you're intending to go into, to work with. I guess the problem is, how do we work together? We're technical specialists. We're working with different disciplines, different people from different countries. We all have our little issues. How we need to put that aside and begin to work together. And we have to learn how to work together because it's dire straits. It is that important. We work together on projects. And there is, I know this is simplified, we have the conceptualization of a new initiative. There's planning, execution, and then the final reporting and deliverables. That implies communication. These are people working together. So we're talking, we're going back and forth, we're communicating. I'm suggesting that we need this whole circle of communication in every aspect of this continuum for a project. Yes, you're communicating, but it's not a focused kind of communication. At the start of a new initiative, are you involving the right people? Are you partnering with the right people? Is what you're trying to do what is really needed? So there's a lot that needs to be discussed at the start. Having that communication perspective, asking all of those questions from the beginning will make you that much more relevant, that much more targeted, that much more efficient all the way through. Because you're asking all the time, you're monitoring all the time, and you're adjusting all the time. It implies a cost, especially in terms of time. And if you're going to bring people in together, time. But you're saving time. You could spend 3 years of a project and be completely off the mark, I think. This little time before means that you would be that much more able to make some kind of impact. Unfortunately, in my experience, I come in at the last stage because we're ready to share the information now. We plan to do 5 fact sheets, and we're going to do a magazine, and we're going to do, and here's what I want you to do. It means then that the questioning that I would have liked before didn't happen. I don't even know if the people that I'm talking to can read or how much they read. And I'm not talking about illiterate people, because if you talk to students right here, they will read for their course, but do they read outside? You know, youngsters tend not to find their information on pieces of paper. Are those the right avenues? Who do you want to reach? Who are we reaching anyway? You know? And when I come in and I start asking questions, well, if I find my mark, then the next project includes a little more communication. But certainly what happens then is that we don't have much money because we've used it all before for the planning and execution of the actual work. So we just want you now to produce these things so that we could show that we did some work. When I talk about communication, I'm talking about a process, back and forth, to make sure that there is understanding and shared meaning, whether it's in interpersonal relationships or in this kind of situation. We're always making sure that there is shared meaning. And when I talked about the conceptualization before, and the planning and involving all of these people, I could feel, you know, you can feel a little anxious about it. How are we going to get everybody to agree? Well, you don't have to get everybody to agree. You agree to a path forward, but you don't agree that, you know, this is what I wanted. You just take everybody's concerns on board. And with the resources you have, this is how we're going to move forward. But we have listened. And we may not be able to take your concern on board to the full extent, but we have heard you, and it's included here, and we plan to do a follow-up where we will do a bigger thrust. You know, somehow it's included, but there is clear understanding that we're moving forward in a particular direction, and this is where we're going. So there's a process of understanding and sharing meaning, not agreement and consensus. Communication and development has been around for a long time, 60 plus years. Development communication is about strategic communication and development projects. The World Bank says, well, this is what they like in their projects, development communication in their projects. It includes a behavioral aspect, so that there is a change in behavior, which means that you have to do some benchmarking at the start. What is the knowledge? What is the attitude? What are the challenges to this particular issue that you're trying to implement in the initiative that you're trying to implement? What are the perceived costs to the community? If we do it this way, what are the perceived costs? So it's not just simple sharing information. It's not information sharing. It's much more in-depth knowledge, attitudes, practices, behavior change. Development support communication is very specific. It's planners coming together, including everybody, but it's a kind of top-down, very specific, very structured. And then communication for development, you might have heard about, which is more participatory, including farmers in things like farmers' field schools. So farmers are taught how to be observant, how to become their own scientists, how to share that with their fellow farmers, and in what we call field schools, farmers' field schools. And that is one way of doing things. Whatever your project involves, there should be a strategic communication approach. So don't get too bogged down in, are we doing communication for development? What method are we going to use? Just be aware that you need to employ communications strategically as a vehicle that will take you from concept to realization. it's going to mean that you'll be more, it's going to be more value for money. You're going to use the resources more efficiently. You're going to transfer this information into knowledge. Information on a fact sheet remains information unless it's transferred into knowledge. And the communication is going to help you now to decide, how are we going to do that? How are we going to take the information from this into knowledge so that we really communicate as the definition said? Of course, we're going to save resources because we're going to be more efficient. And with stakeholder involvement at the start, then you're going to get more buy-in. You're more likely to succeed. We measured outputs. That's how, when we have projects, we measure outputs. We measure how far the research has gone. We have all of these lovely analyses, Gantt charts and whatever. We looked at how many training sessions we've had, how many publications. Still, information. We need to start evaluating impact. Evaluating impact means that at the start, you looked at what was at that point in time. You can't measure where you are now and the change if you don't know where you were at the start. Is there action? Is there behavior change? If not, why not? If not is not failure. If not means that as you were moving along, there was something that was missed, and when you're questioning at this point, it's not going to be missed in future. You could address it now because you now know as you're moving along. The impact is not always at the end. As you're moving along, if not, what do we need to change? What is the impact? What really is the impact of what you're doing? And we need to employ some tools in order to do that. Simple, you know. It's not earth-shattering. It's not hard. We need a communication strategy. That is a living document. I'll show you what the basic elements are. But something that's written, that's shared, there is common understanding. This is how we're doing it from the start. Everybody buys in, this is how we're doing it. And there are resources allocated to this activity, not at the end. Let me tell you what, we have $2 left, but we need to do this. I've stretched $2. I've done it, you know. But we don't need to do that. So we'll move to the communication strategy in a little more detail just now. But we need communication skills. You're excellent scientists. You can't communicate. You can communicate your science. For me, that's all I need you to do. To write your science well so that I can understand it. We've done training up the islands in technical writing, getting scientists to write well. Because once you produce that, then we can use that for other things. We can then I can help you. I can help you to communicate if you don't have those skills. At the very least, you should be able to write well. You need to be able to interact with your colleagues. There's a cross-fertilization that takes place when you interact in a multidisciplinary team. That cannot happen when you remain in your little silos. And that's what's needed. That richness is what is needed. You need to be able to listen. Put aside wanting to hear your own voice. Put aside wanting to get your point across and listen. Even if you're talking to, you know how you can sometimes have an opinion which says, these people are so stubborn. Well, if you don't understand why they're so stubborn, then you're never going to move forward. Listen, why are they not doing it? Why are they not taking up this new crop? Well, because the product that we want to make from it just isn't good, isn't suitable, isn't acceptable to our palates. So, listen. Need to go back to the drawing board and add more starch or something into that, research, into that crop, we need to be able to negotiate. We have $1 million and I want half of it for my portion. How are we going to negotiate within the project? How are we going to decide on how we're moving forward? And then we need to use information and communication technologies. COVID-19 has had silver linings, the lockdown and so. We've used ICTs much more than ever before. I can tell you for the Caribbean. Yeah, the platforms need a little work, but in terms of people using the technology that they were fearful of for years before, they've had to use it. Children have had to go to school online. And parents have had to understand what their children were doing. So they've had to use it. But apart from that, so we have that avenue that we can now employ. Apart from that, we need to use more social media. We need to embrace the facility that offers. We need to use influencers. Young people know the influencers. We need to use songwriters. In the Caribbean, we have calypso, soca music, and we've used it. We've recently had cricket happening in our part of the world, and cricketers who think they could sing have been singing along with other artists about hurricane preparedness throughout the year, because the hurricanes are getting more and more severe. But the music is so catchy that everyone is singing it. Use people like that. We think of ourselves in ivory towers, and we don't want to interact with the artists. Well, they're our best asset sometimes to reach some communities, some groups, young people, people who go to cricket. Communication strategy I spoke about. This is a basic structure. It looks like a project plan, doesn't it? You have objectives, you have expected outcomes, there are key messages. This keeps you targeted and on point and focused, because it's dissipated otherwise. It's like a thesis statement when you're doing research. You come back to this point. You know who your audiences are, the specific tools and strategies, resources, who you're going to partner with so that you're not reinventing the wheel. Budget, measuring success, and then future activities. There was a project that was done between McGill University and the University of the West Indies, improving nutrition and health of CARICOM population, and there were challenges, communication challenges that were identified because they were paying attention. They were communicating to a diverse group, 2 universities within the Caribbean, engaging different audiences and interests, nutrition, schools, farmers, producing, post-harvest, different aspects, getting the support of non-technical people, including policymakers, using data, because the data has to be such that it could be easily used to focus, generating and sustaining political interests, and building credibility as a group working on this. One instance, A challenge recognized inadequate communication among researchers, the people on the extension staff, and the farmers. And there wasn't timely sharing of knowledge with farmers. End of project knowledge sharing workshops got everybody together, talking, nice level playing field. And as a result of that, farmers went away saying, you know what, that makes sense. I think I'm going to investigate this a little bit more. That's what happens. This is just to show you in action if you include communication throughout. And a key recommendation is to include a communications coordinator from the project proposal developmental stage. Enlighten project people, because they recognize that it will facilitate ongoing communication across, establish and maintain a common purpose, gain commitment from all stakeholders, and to ensure that outreach communication is efficient. Let's look at some examples. This was produced under that same UWI McGill project. It's a board game. Throw a dice and you move numbers. And when you get to the star, you're asked a question. If you answer correctly, you move, and it tells you 5 spaces. If you answer incorrectly, you move back. And we even did a life-sized one. The students, we used it at Caribbean Week of Agriculture, which happened every year except for the COVID years. These students were over the moon. They loved this. They loved the competition amongst themselves was fierce. But this is a group that you might not include because they're children. But if you're going to talk nutrition, you need to talk to children. You need to get them choosing nutritious snacks. They would choose. We had that issue on this project of them choosing high sugar, high calorie, preserved snacks in bags, horrible things. Another end of the spectrum is, this is a policy brief now that we produced for decision makers on another project, Caribbean Invasives. It's attractive, easy to access information. I'm going over it again so that you can see. And at the end, there are the key messages synthesized. So even if you just read the last page, the key messages are there. You go through the little setting up the scene. This is the issue. This is the problem. Here's what we propose to deal with it. Here are the key messages. Here are the sources of information so that it's credible. And here's the contact information. But you might wonder, well, why spend all the resources on a policy brief? I mean, these are educated people. But can you think about the amount of information that comes across your desk? This information is not just attractive, it's easily accessible information. So taking the time and the resources to repackage it in this way means that they can spend 5 minutes going through this and they have a good understanding of where you're at. We forget success stories. Nothing talks like success. People like you have done this, and here's how they succeed. FAO did this on climate smart agriculture. We also did something similar on that UWI McGill project. This was produced by CARDI and FAO because, as we spoke about income substitution, and it's one thing to produce substitutes. You do your research and you produce substitutes, but if people don't know how to use it, it's not wheat, it doesn't have gluten. You're making a bread and the thing is flat. It doesn't work, we don't like it. How can you cook with tropical flowers? Leave no one behind. Everybody counts, and we must all be the change. I am aware that I am speaking to a diverse group. But I would like to suggest that even as youngsters here, university students, when you're involved in a project, that you have a voice, that you ask questions, those fundamental questions. Be brave enough to ask those questions so that you are the change. Communication is fundamental to the success of food security initiatives. And wherever you're, well, let us position communication now so that we can become more relevant, more effective, more efficient. Because we simply have no other choice. And this is my logo because I believe that we develop through communication. And I thank you for listening.
Well, thank you so much, Mrs. Johnston, for this insightful, actually, and then comprehensive presentation. I'm opening the floor for some questions now. Questions.
One of the points that
Yep. Let me give you the mic for the live streaming attendees.
One of the points that you made is that scientists have difficulty communicating, and I wonder whether you have any thoughts on whether that needs to be rectified, or whether that needs to be status quo, or what needs to happen.
Yeah, well, this happens far more often than I would have hoped. I think what needs to happen, sometimes we all communicate. Some of us are inherently good communicators. So I made a blanket statement, and as he said it, I said, oh, that's not everybody. But some of us are good communicators. But certainly in a project where you have scientists who communicate well, some not so well, it would be good to have somebody on board and a roadmap to say this is how we're moving in terms of the project communication, and somebody on board who is able to communicate and who is able to get people to share in a non-confrontational way. So hence the reason for communication, depending on the size of your project, of course, somebody who has that responsibility. I said also that scientists are at least supposed to write well. That's not always the case in my experience. So we've had to do training so that whatever your discipline, the structure of a scientific report or scientific paper is the same. You can look at an abstract, you can look at the recommendations, you can look at the conclusions. You mightn't understand the in-between part, but understand what the soil scientist is trying to say, or whoever it is, if that person wrote well. So at the very least, that is what you're obliged to do. Working together in a group, it's more applied research. I expect more communication skills because you're on the ground. You have to work together. You have to work together across the board with your colleagues on the project. You have to work with people in governments. You have to work with other partner organizations. So communication training, even for that group, would be helpful. I've done that as well in institutions where people needed to work together a little bit better. Approached it in the same kind of way. go in talking to everybody, finding out what the issues are, what the gaps are, what the challenges are, and then using that then to get people to work together in the training. So yes, you may need to go as far back, step back, give everybody some sensitivity training, part of communication, especially if you're going into a community that you're not familiar with. So sensitivity training where you learn the cultural norms of a place so that you don't offend anybody in your interactions if you're going to be talking to people. There's a lot that, you know, you can drill down as deep as you need to do for the particular project to achieve success.
Great. Any other question?
I think communication will never get anywhere so long as we don't get our political systems in order. Take Ethiopia. You know, there are so many countries who are starving.
Yeah.
But why? Because the political system is corrupted, a dictatorship's got no spot.
Yeah.
So I find that communication isn't getting anywhere.
Yeah. You know, I don't know if I'm an eternal optimist. And I find there are certain things over which I have no control, like that political. I will leave those people who have expertise in handling communication at that level. I will leave that up to them. But I think we can make very specific interventions. And interventions. So the kind of interventions that have identify an issue on the ground, and this is how we're going to deal with it. So the political situation, even if we look at politics within a country, not even Europe or the European Union, huge, you know, talking about people working together. Let's say the Caribbean, where we have different countries, CARICOM. You can make a difference with, if you partner with the institutions working on the ground. They know the political systems. They know how to get things done. You have to do your homework to see who's doing what, who's the best to partner with, and work to deal with the issues of food insecurity in a very defined kind of way. This is what I'm going to do. Because if we wait for that umbrella type change, well, I don't know, we'll all die. You know, so we have to do what we can with the resources that we can, partnering with those who understand the system in the areas that we're trying to make a difference in, and work from there. The other big umbrella type change, I really don't know. That is going to take time, effort, and expertise that I do not have.
Other questions?
Thank you so much for this interesting presentation. And I just wanted to ask a question as a follow-up to the first question and the last point that you made about us being the younger generation and as we branch out to research. So my question now is, as per your recommendation and as per the responses that you gave about having this sensitivity training, is it something that we should have as we're planning our research as young researchers? Should it be something that should be included in our training? And are there examples of institutions that have done that for students to make them more conscious about these things as they plan their research and as we graduate and also enter academia? So it should start from us now that we're growing. So do you have any, I don't know, experiences or any?
Oh, you're so absolutely right. In my utopic world, it would be definitely a part of your training. I don't know if you have any communication sessions at all, classes or at all, but certainly that is par for the course, you know. But you work with what you have. You're going to be, and especially sometimes with training in academic institutions, we're training scientists. You're talking now about applied research and working in projects. And what I'm suggesting to you is that young people come to those projects without having had that training. So projects I am advocating should provide that facility within a project so that regardless of your sensitivity, your exposure to communication, training, that you are given that support within projects. If you are aware, as you are, then you do courses wherever you can find it. That, let's say you join a project and people are not on board, that you start asking those questions. I've gone into situations where I've been called to do a newsletter. And I've asked, why are you doing this project? But what are you trying to do? And all of those questions. And having that institution step back and say, okay, let's put a halt and let's do a communication strategy at this point. Not too late. So you can ask as a young person those kinds of questions so that you get more focused, even for yourself and for the project, because I'm making the assumption that we're all involved in projects because we have a vested interest in the beneficiaries reaping some impact, that there's some impact to the beneficiaries, that is our main objective. And so if that is it, then you're going to have to do things like put aside your own fear of appearing silly by asking those questions. It's huge. You're asking people who are very top down in an institution, you know. The managers are very difficult to talk to, and you just came out of university. What do you have to say? So I am suggesting that if I can't convince from the top, let me convince from the middle. Ask the questions. Get people thinking a little more sharply and more focused on what it is they're trying to do. Because I know I have worked on projects where it's all nebulous. You know? You're already articulate. You're already willing to ask the questions, I hope. Half the battle won. It's not hard. That's why I'm saying what I'm advocating is a strategic communication approach. So it's not a whole lot of training. It's just an awareness that you need this, that you need to ask questions, that you can use tools like a communication strategy, that you can hone up your own interpersonal communication skills, and then harness social media and Instagram and whatever else that we've not used efficiently before to reach those audiences if we need to.
Other questions?
Yeah, I was surprised to hear that 80% of the food is imported.
Mm-hmm.
How can you explain this? Because the climatic conditions are surely not bad in the in the Caribbean.
In the Caribbean, everything's supposed to grow. Well, it's 80%. This is just some countries, and those would be mainly, remember, we're small.
Yes.
And remember, we have 80% of the food consumed. It's not necessarily food consumed by people living there. So if you're a tourist country, then you have a lot of people coming in, and they're also consumers. So you import a lot of the food that those people eat.
I accept your explanation.
Yes.
But if I'm a tourist
Yes.
and I eat a potato,
Yes.
whether the potato is grown in Canada or in the Caribbean, it's all the same for me.
Yes, exactly. And I am, you know, we have this thrust, and I hope it grows, where tourists are given our food. Try our food,
Yeah.
you know? But that's not always the case. However, we have, for instance, the potatoes don't grow very well where we are, where the soil pests are crazy. We don't want to be lacing the production with a whole lot of chemicals. So I was talking about comparative advantages. So there are islands, there are countries in the Caribbean that produce root crops where the pest levels aren't, you know, as ridiculous as here, as in other countries. So we were doing that in the CARICOM, seeing where we can grow what, and then looking into other ways of growing, like the greenhouse productions, like producing in areas with larger land masses. We drink a lot of coconut water, for instance, in the Caribbean, and we export as well. A lot of that is now being grown in Guyana, where the land is, you know. That kind of production brings up other issues that we won't go into, like what other industries can arise from the shell and the husk. So, yeah, we're looking into that. If we were to substitute our wheat, for instance, then we need to know how to handle what we can produce, like the flour from root crops, breadfruit, and that kind of thing, which is where we're going now. So more and more you're finding people experimenting with street food using local products. But our street food in Trinidad, for instance, cheap street food, very Indian based, it's flour. So now, how do we get acceptance? It's a lot of education that needs to take place too, because the consistency will be different for some things. You may say that a potato is a potato, but the texture might be different and you may not like it. So we have to now we continue to work to make sure that it's acceptable to you, it's acceptable to whoever, with, you know.
Okay, with other words, what I meant to say is something being done?
Absolutely, absolutely.
To train farmers to grow certain foods that have not been, maybe not been known to them, or not known is not the right word, but have not been popular as them.
Yeah, but remember, it's not 80% of the whole Caribbean. Eh? These are just some, right? It's just some. So there's some. And yes, we have a vibrant agricultural community throughout the region. And yes, we are looking into not only substituting what we eat, the imports, but also for exports. So we do have a vibrant agricultural. Don't worry. And as I showed you, that little 45 years of CARICOM intervention in agriculture, food and agriculture, there have been all the time initiatives, all the time. Initiatives getting us to take advantage of our little microclimates to produce different things. You know, so like in Grenada, for instance, at one time before the mealybug came into the region, they were fruit fly free. Mealybug is not fruit fly, but let's, you know. And so we got a lot of our fruit from them. We have fruit fly where we are. So, you know, so everybody taking advantage of whatever their comparative advantage is. And working together, realizing that a small island, we can't be self-sufficient. But if we rely on each other, you know, we as a region, we could do much better.
Great. Any other questions? Yes, no? All right. Thank you so much, Mrs. Johnston. Again, thank you for for being with us today, and please join me to thank her with a small gift from McGill University. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.